In June 1920, Benito Mussolini declared that Italy must energetically cleanse the border town of Trieste. Trieste and a second border town, Fiume, had become home to around 300,000 Slavs in the wake of World War I and Italy's occupation of those territories. This Slavic population quickly became subject to intense racial hatred from Italian nationalists and fascists, who saw them as an internal enemy, threatening the racial harmony of the Italian nation. And these nationalists and fascists took it upon themselves to protect Italy from the eternal barbarian and reclaim these border towns in the name of the Italian nation. Mussolini's declaration to cleanse these towns mobilised the Italian squadrismo, the black shirts, to take up the violence which would become characteristic of Italian fascism. Fascists took to the streets in Italy, burning Slavic headquarters and hunting down anyone they considered to be a racial enemy. It amounted to, essentially, an ethnic cleansing. Now, not only was this one of the earliest moments of fascist racial violence, but this border fascism became a model applicable in other parts of the country. The racist violence of border management and racial nationalist fervour wasn't only the initial motivating force of fascist squadrismo, but the model which Italian fascist regime would later follow. The racial nationalism of fascism understood the border to be something not only expandable, but as a racial cleansing mechanism in defence of the nation. The racial nature of fascism was crystallised in its early years through what Bosworth labels as border fascism. Over 3 nights in June this year, far-right mobs in Belfast, Glasgow and Edinburgh took to the streets ostensibly in protest over violence enacted by migrants. These mobs stormed through the streets, went door to door, hunting migrants and anyone who looked like a racial other, and burning down houses in scenes which cannot but be compared to the initial moment of Italian border fascism. Now, I don't want to over-egg my comparison here. Both of these examples have specific contexts which impact the manifestation of fascism. For example, in Italy, the role of anti-communism was much greater, whereas in the north of Ireland, loyalist organisations were involved in structuring and organising the violence. I also don't want to imply that contemporary developments of fascism are necessarily just shadows or repetitions of earlier forms, but there are clear consistencies between the border fascism of 1920s Italy and the central role of border regimes in generating contemporary fascism, whether that's in Belfast or ICE in the US or Maloney's femo-nationalism in contemporary Italy today. As Pantazis argued, any fascist-type process that may be unleashed will undoubtedly not take the form that it did in the past. Unlike the previous experience of fascism, however, such a process would involve not so much outside infiltration or investment of the state apparatus as a break within the state following lines that have already been traced in its present configuration. So in this video, which is based on this recent publication from myself and my friend Cian Aspinall, I'm going to show you how the emergence of contemporary fascism is very real and rooted within the pre-existing context of neoliberal society, including in its racial border regime. In contrast with some of the paradigmatic liberal scholars of fascism like Roger Griffin, I'll argue that fascism is not a revolutionary break from pre-existing liberal order, but following Pantazis, it's an intensification or break within the state following lines that have already been traced in its present configuration. Fascism, as W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out, grows its hidden roots within the racial construction of global liberal imperialism. So fascism is a notoriously difficult concept to define. The historian Ian Crenshaw once argued that trying to define it is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. That image is what I do to my brain on weekends too. Similarly, citing Tasca, Adrian Littleton back in 1976 had already argued that there were already too many conflicting definitions of fascism. Now, to be fair, part of this is a general issue in defining any social phenomena. Often we want an easy kind of Weberian ideal type with which to compare, like a simple model we can pick up and apply to other places. And that can be a useful heuristic to identify certain things, but unfortunately, social phenomena like fascism or like neoliberalism are complex and dynamic. Their edges bleed into each other. As Littleton points out in the Italian context, fascism was not static, but continually changing. and it was not an entity in itself, but the resultant of a whole situation from which it cannot be separated. So as a concept, fascism has always been quite slippy, like my brain on weekends. Mussolini was not an intricate political theorist, but quite often, just a petty opportunist.
Perché mai dovremmo metterci dalla parte dei vampiri?
He had little capacity for long-range planning. His fascism was dynamic and changing, you might say opportunistic, meaning that it was altered and structured by wider political contexts, and fundamentally by the existing social relations of liberal Italian society. And this has meant that fascism has always been hard to define. You know, even if you go back to post-1945 debates, you will find claims that the Nazis themselves, they weren't really fascists. They were their own type of ultranationalist racial authoritarians. It's not fascism unless it comes from the fascist region of Italy, otherwise it's just sparkling authoritarianism. I used that joke in a conference presentation recently and you wouldn't believe the titter it got. It was titters for days. Because of these definitional issues, there have been multiple readings of what constitutes fascism, and I think this has led to an over-reliance on the kind of aesthetic appearances of fascism, which is why I think for many liberals, fascism is understood as a total revolutionary break from liberalism. It's seen as a reaction to the sort of aesthetics of the liberal order. And by aesthetics, I don't just mean like the clothing, I mean like the surface appearance of liberalism. Things like the presence of formal party democracy, or the sort of superficial presence of an independent judiciary. Obviously, these are things that are contested even within liberal regimes, but the undermining of these key liberal rights and institutions is seen as a kind of key indicator of the presence of fascism. There's a single dictator, a mass party, a suppression of democratic norms, the presence of a street movement. And again, I'm not saying these features are unimportant. They in fact allow us to detect fascism when they do appear, and very obviously so. But an over-reliance on them leaves unexamined the actual underlying social relations which underpin fascism, and leaves us lost if fascism reappears in a slightly different form, a slightly different surface appearance than how it originally emerged. So for example, do we really need a single-party dictator if the state has been so hollowed out of any meaningful democratic structures? Do we really need a street movement when ICE exists, or when the police do that function anyway? Do we need a single mass party when political parties are unable to stray from a single doctrine and have been pursuing a kind of massified politics for decades anyway? If we're so concerned with the re-emergence of fascism in the exact appearance as interwar Europe, then we end up blinding ourselves to its hidden roots, growing ever stronger within our current moment. So let's move beyond the particular appearance of fascism and start looking at its ideology. The preeminent liberal scholar of fascism, R.J.B, and my friend told me he's known as the old man of fascist studies within the field, which is quite cute. But he articulated what has become maybe the paradigmatic definition of fascism in the contemporary world. For Griffin, fascism is a political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Palingenesis here refers to a notion of national rebirth. Think, for example, of the Italian fascist claim to renew the Roman Empire, or Nazism's new man, or make America great again. For Griffin, this ultranationalism serves to construct a particular national unity which necessarily must police the boundaries of who is included within the national project. Now, of course, this is hardly unique to fascism. In a previous video, I spoke about how the capitalist state presents the interests of capital, the interests of the bourgeois, as the interests of the people nation as a whole.
No more bosses versus workers. We are on the same side, the same team, and Britain United will win.
And so while we can draw a sometimes blurry distinction between fascist state and a liberal one, there's already a kind of definitional ambiguity at work here which indicates the boundaries between these forms are less firm than liberals would prefer. But another issue here is that it reduces fascism and its racism as an ideology, which is kind of unmoored from the fundamental social relations of society, the fundamental labour relations. And this allows liberals to kind of hermetically seal fascism away from the liberal soil in which it takes root. And this has been a long-standing critique of liberal perspectives. For example, the liberal reading of fascism, which emphasises the revolutionary break from prior liberalism, has tended to view fascism as a foreign imported phenomenon which had no lasting effects on Italian society. According to the liberal view, Italy's pre-fascist body politic had emerged unscathed and healthy from the fascist experience, and thus still could be seen to represent a viable option as the foundation on which to build the post-fascist nation. Critiques which kind of emphasise the continuities between liberalism and fascism often draw on black radical and communist perspectives. Not exclusively, but often. And black radicalism itself has long troubled the notion that fascism is necessarily a revolutionary break from liberalism, drawing especially on colonial violence and racial violence in the south of the US. Black radicals have emphasised that race is an essential pillar of fascism, which is rooted within the deep social relations of liberal imperialism. And while liberals will obviously highlight that racism is essential to fascism, they tend to view it as a kind of particular form of extreme behaviour or ideology. Whereas for black radicals and Marxists like W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James, fascism is inherently tied together with the racialised nature of imperialist capitalism. Du Bois, for example, pointed to the proto-fascist violence of the Ku Klux Klan, whereas C.L.R. James and others pointed to liberal and then fascist Italy's imperial ambitions in Ethiopia and Libya. So in this sense, fascism wasn't simply like a feature of European ideology, but produced by the fundamentally co-constitutive racial class relations of imperialist liberal capitalism. It's not an ideology, well, it's not just an ideology, it's emergent from the structure of society itself. But we can't just say that all liberalism, neo or otherwise, is necessarily fascism. To do so would be to lose any analytic specificity. So we then get back to the question, if the fascist potential is always present in liberal terrain, if it left much intact from the past, if it did not assault the family, it did little to alter the existing distribution of property, then what does distinguish it from liberalism? What actually is fascism? So in my view, and the view we go into way more detail in this paper, fascism isn't a behaviour or an ideology, but like neoliberalism, it is a moment of capitalist hegemony. And this means that fascism is a productive interaction between ideology, state, and the fundamental social relations of society. It's made up of a historically specific bloc, a historical bloc, or compromise between different segments of society who are brought together under a specific national project. And this means that while ultranationalist palingenesis is at the heart of fascist ideology, this ideology emerges from the social relations and economic arrangements of society. Hence we get a series of at least 3 overlaps between neoliberalism and what constitutes emerging fascism. Henry Marr, who edited the special edition our paper featured in, identified 3 areas where neoliberal thought and fascism overlap. Firstly, in the racial construction of the market economy. Marr highlights how figures like Ludwig von Mises and his student Friedrich Hayek understood that only white civilization was sufficiently advanced enough to produce proper market economies. This led to a promotion of border regimes to repel Orientalist hordes who would undermine true market society. We can see the connections again between Trieste and Belfast, and of course ICE as well. It is vain to deny that up to now certain races have contributed nothing or very little to the development of civilization and can, in this sense, be called inferior. For von Mises, the white races of Europe were the culturally superior races of the world, and the only ones capable of inventing and sustaining neoliberal market culture. And he makes this more explicit. It must be emphasised that the destiny of modern civilization as developed by the white peoples in the last 200 years is inseparably linked with the fate of economic science. This civilization was able to spring into existence because the peoples were dominated by ideas which were the application of the teachings of economics to the problems of economic policy. You know, white supremacy makes you better at economics. Apparently, it's That's why you should never trust an economist. But we can see here the ideological overlap between white nationalist neoliberals and fascism.
We believe Palantir is a metaphor for the splendor and artistry and discipline necessary to build great things, what has made the West great over thousands of years.
The repelling of culturally inferior, infecting, Orientalist hordes, threats to the racial purity of not just a particular nation, but a particular civilization as well. A second feature Marr points to, which is also consistent with Wendy Brown's work on neoliberalism, is its maintenance of traditional patriarchal gender roles. Brown highlights Hayek's insistence that traditional patriarchal morality is like the glue that holds together market society. For Hayek, you need that kind of social glue of traditional morality, of the traditional family, the patriarchal family, in order to make market society work. It's like, uh-oh. And the final moment of overlap that Marr points to is the consistent anti-communism present in both.
America will never be a communist country. Won't happen. Communism is a loser, and it always will be. The communist system is the opposite of the American system, and the communist system has never worked. Our warriors did not fight communism on battlefields across the world, only to have that menace rear its ugly head right back here in America. We're not going to let it happen.
And I would also add, though I won't have time to go into it in this video today, the way that disability is treated by both neoliberalism and fascism is, I think, procreant. A disciplinary force which treats disabled people as social waste to be expelled. This is, an aside, but we are planning to turn this paper into a book, and I want to look deeper into the connections between neoliberal disability and emergent fascism, especially in the context of Trump's calls to open, as he says, mental asylums.
Signed an executive order to bring back mental institutions and insane asylums. We're going to have to bring them back. Hate to build those suckers, but you got to get the people off the streets.
But for this video, because it's already too dense and too long, we will just focus on the overlaps between fascist and neoliberal racial and gender regimes, alongside a recognition that neoliberal hegemony has also produced a state form which is deeply authoritarian and ready-made for fascist domination. So, just for clarity, neoliberalism and fascism contain racial and patriarchal ideology, but what I'm interested in is the fundamental social relations that are productive of that ideology, and further, what allows these relations to become increasingly intensified as the neoliberal state becomes increasingly authoritarian. That is, what causes authoritarian neoliberalism to transform into neoliberal fascism. And what we argue is that the cause of this is crisis. Neoliberalism is racked with crisis. It was born of a profitability crisis, a crisis as the post-war hegemonic compromise cracked, and ever since it has been constantly racked with crisis. Crisis is everywhere. There are economic crises like 2008, which resulted in even more entrenched authoritarianism. There are social crises like the care crises, which we'll go into later. And there are nationalistic crises like the migration crisis, or the small boat crisis, or the border crisis. Crisis after crisis after crisis, necessitating even more neoliberal and ever more fascistic fixes. And overarching all of this is the pervasive climate crisis. And these are not all of the same order, and they're not all equally true or legitimate, but their presence shows that neoliberalism is not just prone to crisis, but a state of perpetual crisis, which makes the intensification of its racial and gendered and authoritarian order all the more likely. Now, I'm not saying that neoliberalism must inevitably lead to fascism. There are countervailing forces, conjunctural conditions which might stop the full re-emergence of fascism, but it has created a terrain fertilized by pervasive crisis in which the potential for fascism to grow is very strong. And so what fascism is then is an intensification of ultranationalist racial politics, a conjunction with ultra-patriarchal gender politics, and an authoritarian state which curtails democratic engagement and is increasingly authoritarian in squashing out dissent. These three features, while not comprehensive to all of fascism, give us a good indication of what is happening, of a fascist moment. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to talk first about the authoritarian neoliberal state, neoliberalism's gender and racial regime, and finish on how these features are kind of reproducing fascism for our time. The implication for this is, the only way to put it down for good is not to re-establish liberalism, as those like Roger Griffin would argue, but to fundamentally break from liberalism, from imperialism, and from capitalism. It's socialism or barbarism once again. If you look around you today, it's impossible not to see that the state is getting ever more authoritarian. I was outside Woolwich Court the other week as a judge sentenced activists who broke into an arms factory owned by Israeli arms manufacturers Elbit to between 5 and 8 years under terrorism charges that the jury were not aware would be considered. I was outside as the police were violent, arresting people for nothing and instigating anti-protest measures that have been recently passed by the Labour government. In the US, 8 people have been sentenced to between 30 and 100 years in prison for an array of charges, including aiding terrorism, for taking part in action outside an ICE detention facility. The inclusion of terrorism in these charges comes after Trump proscribed Antifa as a terrorist organisation. There has been a well-documented attack on protest rights across the world. Research by scholars including one of my Viva examiners, Oscar Berglund, has highlighted the increasing repression of climate protesters globally, whereas the police monitoring NGO NetPol has labelled the state of policing in the UK as repression. A recent report co-authored by another friend of mine, David White, in conjunction with Queen Mary University and the Defender Juries campaign, highlights the intensifying process of repressive policing in relation to environmental protest and Palestine solidarity, including attacks on trial by juries, which is a pillar of the judicial system. Repression is ramping up throughout neoliberal societies, but it would be a mistake to think that this is a new feature of neoliberalism, nor is policing the only form of authoritarianism within the neoliberal state. It's instead just an intensification of previous tendencies, intensified through the pervasive crises. So let's take a step back. Again, in a previous video, I went into detail about the concept of authoritarian statism, so I won't spend too much time going over that again. But if we return to Pantazis, we can get a good initial diagnosis of the turn towards an increasingly authoritarian state form from way back in 1978. Pantazis argues that in the context of a crisis for the post-Fordist state and the need to reassert the power of capital over labour, democratic structures are hollowed out as intensified state control over every sphere of socio-economic life, combined with radical decline of institutions of political democracy and with draconian and multiform curtailment of so-called formal liberties, whose reality is being discovered now that they are going overboard. Although some of these changes have been operating for a long time, the present-day state marks a veritable turn in the relation of state forms. So as labour is disciplined, disorganised and ejected from the hegemonic bloc, the post-Fordist hegemonic bloc, the social relations from which the state emerges are altered, resulting in an increasingly authoritarian neoliberal state. And so returning to anti-protest laws, we can see early forms of this in the radical curtailment of union rights and the increased policing of strike action. It's notable that the first coordinated national police service in the UK was created by Thatcher to suppress the miners. And looking back at Italian fascism, we can again draw on some continuities. As Littleton points out, the limitations on the right to strike throughout the liberal period in Italy made the transition to fascism smoother. However, even these continuities may be seen as not truly decisive compared with the change represented by the effective suppression of almost all possibility of protest against administrative injustice. This highlights again that we're not saying all neoliberalism is inherently and necessarily fascist, or must necessarily always become fascist, but rather that we can see the hidden roots of fascist transition spreading through the very form of the state. All it needs is a little sprinkling of fertilizer, a fertilizing crisis to encourage growth. Unfortunately, crisis is what we've got. in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, scholars like Ian Brough and Bob Jessup argued that neoliberal hegemony became increasingly authoritarian. The crash of political legitimacy led the state to increasingly hollow out ever more democratic organs of the state, whether through privatising functions like border controls or by exporting functions to non-democratic bodies like central banks, or by constitutionalising austerity politics through things like Brazil's EC 95, which embedded austerity within the Brazilian constitution for 20 years. For Bob Jessup, this is called an austerity polity. It's a previously conjunctural or temporary fix to crises has become so embedded in the state form that it's permanently altered. The state is permanently altered. So crises like 2008 intensified the already authoritarian nature of neoliberal hegemony. And then as COVID or climate disaster or inflation or war or the polycrisis, as Adam Tooze likes to say, as these continue, this intensification is likely to continue and get even worse. And so the combination of ejecting unionised labour from the historical block of post-Fordist hegemony, the distancing of democratic control over the economy, and the expansion of carceral mechanism used to suppress dissent and fix perpetual crises, demonstrates that neoliberalism is an authoritarian state form, and it is ready-made for fascist domination. And this becomes even clearer as several scholars of fascism have argued that fascism was never truly a totalitarian state. It was never about pure one-party rule over everything, and Mussolini himself relied on strengthening certain liberal state structures to maintain his own power rather than destroying them or subordinating them entirely to the party. So when people are put up an opposition to this saying, well, it's not totalitarian yet, there's still democratic structures, that was true of fascist Italy. Following Palance's argument then, that fascism appears as a reaction to the defeat of counter-hegemonic social forces, of labour movements, of the strength of socialist revolutionary forces, and alongside Littleton's view as well, that fascism only really ramped up after the defeat of working class power, the intensified neoliberal conditions whereby political resistance is ever more harshly repressed presents a really clear condition for the rise of contemporary forms of fascism. Not that I'm worried. But fascism does need more than just an authoritarian state. It requires intense forms of racial and patriarchal domination. And luckily enough, neoliberalism provides that fertile context too.
You've no idea how much I've got to do. Remember, I haven't got your dream kitchen to make things easier.
This whole kitchen was designed for efficiency and convenience.
So, part of the transition from post-Fordism to neoliberalism included, as I said, the expulsion of organised labour from the hegemonic bloc. Labour was forcibly expelled through authoritarian attacks on unions alongside globalisation or the relocation of production to the global south, where the value of labour power was far lower, undermining the power of labour in the metropole. But crucially, alongside this, capital also reacted to the emergence of feminist social movements who challenged the dominance of the patriarchy of the wage, which, it subordinated women within the household. Capital reacted to this by integrating women as a reserve army of labour into the workforce, which, again, undermined the power of organised labour. I'm not saying this is good, but women were not an organised workforce. They were not well unionised in comparison, and so they could act as a kind of disciplinary, deflationary power on organised labour. But crucially, the mass entry of women into the workforce didn't come alongside a liberation from patriarchy. Instead, gendered divisions of labour, which were fracturing through the sort of new social movement mobilisations, were reaccumulated through the privatisation of previously state-mediated forms of social reproduction, of care labour, and they were reprivatised back onto women and into the household, and in so doing were naturalised not as forms of labour, as essential forms of social reproductive labour, but as naturalised care work. Women were now responsibilised into engaging in both waged labour and unwaged social reproductive labour, leading to yet another cannibalistic crisis of the reproduction of labour power. This crisis itself required a colonial solution to the housework problem. a massive influx of feminised migrant care labour and the construction of global care chains, which provided cheap, insecure, racialised labour to carry out the social reproductive duties exported to the market by those classes of women who could now afford to hire help. And through this, neoliberal hegemony produced a new international division of both productive and reproductive labour, which was made possible by organising labour along both racial and gender dimension, inscribing some workers as exploitable and expendable, and others as not. And all of this placed deflationary pressure on wages within the global north and reinforced gendered and racial class divisions. And now I'm not saying it's bad that women were mobilised into the workforce. It is good that the patriarchy of the wage was shattered, but in order to kind of co-opt and also then reinforce patriarchy, neoliberalism did this moment of a reprivatisation of social care. So it was like a kind of false liberation, is what I'm arguing. The true solution is complete degendering of care labour, obvious, a socialisation and degendering of all labour, including care labour. And I've spoken about this many times in other videos, so again, I won't go too deep into it. But essentially, through the refamiliarisation of care labour, patriarchal structures are reinforced, which generates a peculiar form of neoliberal patriarchy. And this neoliberal gender division of labour naturalises women as legitimate providers of reproductive labour, of care labour, of household work.
According to a new Gallup poll, despite the fact that women are working more hours, pursuing careers, and taking care of the kids, women are still more likely than men to take on the dreaded domestic drudgery.
It subordinates the economy and the household to male power, and crucially requires the regulation of sexuality too. As Ellie Gore really usefully summarises, I really recommend that article, the production of racialised and gendered transgression, that is the non-heteronormative, is part and parcel of the production of the idealised and the normative, white, middle-class, heterosexual. And this can here also help explain the rise in transphobia across the world, which Judith Butler has labelled as a dominant strain of fascism for our times, while also explaining the kind of explosion of weird pro-natalist politics from freaks like Elon Musk.
Elon Musk is on a mission to make more babies.
I think for most countries, they should view the birth rate as the single biggest problem they need to solve.
I had to subject you to one of his horrible clips. I just had to. I'm sorry. Not a relevant clip, I just think he's awful. And I'm kind of fascinated. It's like smelling, puke or something. I'm kind of fascinated by how horrible it is. But by regulating and reaffirming traditional labour roles through the foundational labour relations of society, neoliberalism again reaches back into that fetid pit of fascism. Marr again notes that fascism is characterised by a traditional understanding of gender roles, in which women are primarily expected to be childbearers and homemakers, responsible for reproducing the white race. Family units had to be safeguarded from the malign, feminising influence of foreign Jews.
We don't really want to market natalism to the progressive feminists. The people maxing out their fertility should be people, ideally, who won't raise their children to be gender-neutral furries.
Some of the earliest acts of institutional violence the Nazis enacted was obviously the destruction of the research of Magnus Hirschfeld and his Sexual Science Institute in May 1933. And this was coupled with the closure and destruction of gay and lesbian bars before the arrest of and shipping of gay men to concentration camps, all in the name of creating a clean Reich. For the Nazis, queerness and homosexuality were degenerate imports from foreign Jews who wanted to undermine the patriarchal family, the gender division of labour, and also they wanted to feminise society. And so while there is a degree of liberalisation of women's rights through some forms of progressive neoliberalism, you can see the conditions for which that re-undermining occurs, because we have re-inscribed and renaturalized the role of women as natural care providers, even when there is some limited progress made in the form of political rights. And there's the case of why neoliberalism is not always fascist, but how the conditions for its undermining and its fascistization can be created. For example, you can see the return of this discourse of racial threat to the national patriarchal family in the neoliberal age, particularly through the familiar trope of the Muslim grooming gang. The femi-nationalist threat of Muslim grooming gangs is a long-standing far-right Islamophobic trope, which is frequently supported by mainstream political parties and media outlets.
Should the Pakistani rape gang scandal actually be called the Islamic rape gang scandal?
Fucking voice, man.
Like prior Nazi fears of racialised attacks on the family, women and girls are said to be under attack from a force of invading and innately evil Muslim men. For the far right, Orientalist hordes of Muslim men not only attack our women, but disrupt ideals of maternal femininity which reproduce the white race. Native women need protecting. They need to maintain strict biological essentialist patriarchal gender regimes. And, the recent far-right anti-immigrant riots in the UK were sparked by a racist claim that a mass stabbing of white children was perpetrated by a Muslim immigrant. The racialised discourse to protecting the women of Europe has also been mobilised by Giorgia Meloni in Italy to forward her far-right agenda. Race, nationhood and family safeguarding are all tied together within a sort of emergent far-right discourse, which is only supported by the neoliberal reaccumulation of these patriarchal class relations. That is the soil in which these things can take root. The reaccumulation of gendered class relations generates the social relations from which extreme misogynistic politics can re-emerge. And once again, I'm not saying neoliberalism is always fascistically patriarchal. There are progressive forms of neoliberal feminism or post-feminism which co-opt feminist discourses into neoliberalism. But once again, because I know people will comment this, as crisis intensifies the underlying social relations, they become more embedded and more likely to transform into fascistic forms. For example, you can actually trace quite clearly how post-2008 and post-COVID, the state has increasingly forced women into responsibility for familial care, which has recursively recreated patriarchal ideology. And it also creates its own style of fascistic gender politics from women as well, through trends like tradwives.
The rebellion really came when I met my husband, and he being very traditional as well, I think he just identified that. He said, I know that you want a man to look after you and to make you feel secure, and he offered himself as that person. And as soon as that happened, I just was like, finally someone sees it, finally I can be myself. I don't have to hide who I am anymore. It's almost like the fairy tale came true. You
increasingly see women unhappy about having to work shit jobs while also undertaking care work and reacting to this horrible condition by fetishizing the role of the housewife. It's fucked, frankly. It's fucked. And so we have gendered divisions of labour and an authoritarian state system. But a further piece of the puzzle is connected to this global division of care, which requires severe border regimes to filter and discipline labour, creating racialised hierarchies of productive and reproductive labour. So in this last section, I'll describe neoliberalism's global racial regime, which reinscribes white supremacy and nationalism for the modern age, laying the ground for the emergence of ideological ultranationalist palingenesis. So many words. What a good tongue twister. Let's look back at Trieste and Belfast, two moments of violence defined by bordering and exemplifying the specific articulation of fascism of each age. In both cases, the border acted as a tool of racialisation. It demarcates the boundary of who is an acceptable member of the national body and who is not. Neoliberalism has long utilised the border to manage this acceptability, even within more progressive neoliberalisms. The concept of multiculturalism, which is bad not for the reasons the right wing say, but because it was always about inscribing certain acceptability to some model minorities and unacceptability of others. That's what multiculturalism did.
Make it easier to attract highly skilled entrepreneurs from beyond our borders. It would make sure that everybody plays by the same rules by providing a pathway to earn citizenship for those who are living in the shadows. A path that includes passing a background check and learning English and paying taxes and a penalty and getting in line behind it. Everyone trying to come here the right way.
And you see the limits of multiculturalism with the recent murder of Henry Novak by a Sikh man, which led to a widespread attack on Sikhism, which has long been presented as a sort of model minority. The turn against this racialised population within a broader anti-migrant politics really showed how neoliberal multiculturalism rested on a continued racial ordering of the nation, which could easily be transformed to fascistic ends. Several authors have detailed how the neoliberal period has been characterised by major transformations in the operations of borders and migration. Adam Hanea details three major transformations: the securitisation of borders and the privatisation of migration and border management, and the offloading of border controls to third countries. And this has come alongside a feminisation of migration, which is integral to the construction of global care chains and the proliferation of temporary labour contracts, which use this hard border regime, this privatised, militarised hard border regime, to filter and organise migrant labour across different class dimensions.
This is the new slavery. That's what one worker told us when describing the government's temporary foreign worker program in the agricultural industry.
And he further points out that there's been a massive increase in global remittance rates. That is the rate of money that is sent from migrants back home to support families, which indicates that there's been a dramatic increase in migrant flows under neoliberal hegemony. And we should take care to note that the selective filtering of migration through neoliberal border regimes structures both bourgeois and proletarian class relations. Like, if you are a capitalist, you can move pretty much freely.
Make it easier to attract highly skilled entrepreneurs from beyond our borders.
And the ability of you to do that is a class construction. The border allows you to do that because you are a capitalist, even if there is a racial element there. So the kind of racial filtering creates diverse and complex class relations which are sort of mediated by race and by your position within the mode of production, basically. This sort of selective filtering labels some migrants, the capitalists, the contributors in some specific sense. They're not talking about cleaners often for some reason, but it labels some migrants as good contributors to the national coffers and others as bad, illegal takers, which justifies a kind of tiered visa system where wealthier migrants can more easily cross borders while others are kept precarious, never assimilated into the state through the use of temporary visas. They're kept precarious, they're kept uneasy, they're kept as kind of racial others. And neoliberal multiculturalism operates through this to justify the inscription of those properly integrated and class-privileged migrants as good, while those illegals and refugees as undeserving parasites that need to be expelled from the national body, maybe through walking through the streets, door to door, burning houses down.
When you bring in the foreign element, people quite rightly go, hold on a minute, I'm paying into this, and nearly 2 million foreign citizens have just arrived here. They're not working, giving anything back, they're just screwing us for money.
The construction of global care chains and the globalisation of production reproduces this distinct form of neoliberal racialisation, whereby the selective inclusion and exclusion of migrant labour within the nation brands them as foreigners against the native national population, thereby superimposing race atop a nation state. Race becomes a defining structural feature of the nation, or it becomes an even more intense one. So migrant women who are imported to perform socially reproductive labour for often white middle-class families are often women of colour from the global south. And this trend extends across the global north. This includes places like the UK, Spain, Sweden, and the US, where there's been a sharp increase in racialised migrant women being hired by disproportionately white families for cheap domestic labour. This racialisation, produced in conjunction with the hard border regime, has produced the conditions of extreme nationalistic policies. For example, the AfD in Germany, amidst calls for re-immigration, has highlighted Canada's live-in care programme and Canada's immigration system as a whole as an ideal immigration system, as it allows for the intense use of racialised labour in slave-like conditions while maintaining a nationalistic exclusion of those filthy foreigners from the national body. And you can see this getting worse as time goes on, as pervasive migrant crises from ICE, to the UK's small boat crisis, to the EU president describing Greece as Europe's civilizational shield.
I thank Greece for being our European Aspida.
These racial social relations provide the basis for the ideological overlaps between neoliberalism and fascism. They are the context for the riots in Belfast, or the man who was storming through the streets of Edinburgh with a machete, looking for Muslims to kill in the name of national safety. But more than just migration, this exporting of production and the global division of labour makes possible the mass consumption of populations in the global north, which allows for the reabsorption of those formerly unionised, formerly, organised labour blocks. It disorganises them as organised labour and reabsorbs them as individuals or as consumers within a national hegemonic bloc. The good life under neoliberalism is defined by this imperial mode of living. And think back to what Du Bois said about imperialism and racialism. We can understand the modern imperial mode of living as a state whereby consent to hegemony is bought by a constant increase in the consumption of commodities produced cheaply, which we should always read as violently, by super-exploited racialised populations, largely in the global south. And this creates a sort of paradoxically individualised yet massified population of bourgeoisified consumers who see their particular national living standards as evidence for superiority of the nation. And we can find a really good example of this if we look at the proliferation of Americans on Twitter, and I refuse to call it X, not for any real moral reasons, but just because it sucks. It's a bad name. These Americans, though, who use the phrase Europoors and point to things like cars or big portions of food or, fucking granola choice as evidence of the superiority of the US as a national entity. They are pointing to consumption made possible by the international division of labour as evidence of national superiority. Once again, though, I'm not saying that all these people are all fascists. Annoying pricks, for sure, but not necessarily fascist. But what I am saying is that this kind of language, this kind of discourse, shows how the ability to consume as much as possible within these global racially inscribed regimes of production are tied up with reactionary nationalism as an essential element of the hegemonic bloc of neoliberalism, which can so easily be transformed fascistically. The global division of labour operates alongside the expansion of bordering as a tool of racial ordering to plough the neoliberal field and plant the fascist seed. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. A final point worth mentioning is that as social conditions have deteriorated since 2008 for segments of those in the Imperial Core 2, the legitimacy of this consumptive bargain has frayed. And we've seen a sort of increased opposition to globalisation and to migration. Workers recognise that they've been shafted by deindustrialisation, and we get this kind of fetishisation of a national rebirth akin to Griffin's palingenesis, often directed at migrants for somehow ruining it, somehow ruining the conditions when it's not the migrants. MAGA or Restore Britain or any number of fascistic groups are obsessed with the apparent left behind white working class.
White working class boys are now the worst performing group in this country in terms of the education system.
And white working class doesn't exist, really. The working class is a formation, a global formation. Whiteness is used to bind a working class within a racially dominant system. There are white people who are working class, but their whiteness is not the defining feature. We've got to be careful because this is not just, race is not just an ideology that's cynically mobilised by the bourgeois to disorganise us. It is emergent from the social relations of society. So whiteness is generated by these conditions. These social conditions, this racial inscription of labour, this migration condition, that generates racism, it generates whiteness from within particular communities. But the notion that the white working class is an objectively existing social formation which exists independently of that ideology born of the social relations is false. We cannot reify the white working class as a thing which exists outside of white supremacy and domination. The whiteness is racism. Or the fascist groups that mobilise the language of the white working class and make promises to restore industrial heartlands are creating the sort of palingenetic myth.
We are going to put our coal miners back to work.
But it'll never work. We will never get a return to the sort of mythic ideal that these people draw towards. Mass consumption requires the super exploitation of the global south. Industry will not return to the imperial core. There is a core contradiction, another crisis, which only gets resolved with further racial nationalism, further anti-migrant politics. You know, they're stealing our jobs. That shit, that reinforces the palingenetic myth. And it is not ideal. So this is a long video. I know, it's long. So I'm going to try and sum it up and draw some short conclusions and then let you go about your day depressed by, I'm assuming, your favourite YouTuber. I'm your favourite, right? Fascism and neoliberalism share some significant ideological overlaps, from the maintenance of patriarchal gender roles to a white supremacist understanding of the superiority of market society. But what I have tried to show here, what I've tried to emphasise in this video and in our paper, which goes into this far more deeply, is that these overlaps are not just ideological, but go right to the foundations of neoliberal and fascist hegemony. The authoritarian state disorganises labour out of its unionised form and reorganises it as a mass of national consumers, a contemporary style of massification. Simultaneously, democratic forms of managing the state are hollowed out, while repressive measures like policing protest and union activity are dramatically ramped up. This is the authoritarian state form which is ready-made for fascist domination. And within this authoritarian state form, global trends in migration, bordering, and the subordination of women through violent proletarianisation and of care labour reinforce foundational racial and gender class hierarchies which generate patriarchal and nationalist ideologies. I know that some people will just still come at me and say, oh, so neoliberalism is just fascism then? You're just diluting fascism. Not what I'm saying. The neoliberal fascist nexus, or neoliberal fascism, is a condition which creates the possibility, the strong possibility, that through pervasive crises, the nationalism, racism, authoritarianism, and patriarchy endemic to neoliberalism could be transformed into fascism, and that we may be in that transformation right now. Liberalism believes that fascism can just be put down with a reinstatement of the ideological and institutional status quo. And that may be true in the short term, but if we locate the hidden roots of fascism within the conditions of liberalism, then we realise that we can't just cut the head off the weed. We have to pull it out whole cloth and salt the ground in which it could take root. In short, we need to abolish not only fascist social relations, but the social relations of liberal capitalism too. Climate catastrophe looms over everything. I am roasting. Crisis upon crisis upon crisis, fertilising the fascist weed all the more as time goes on. We need to pull up those weeds. We need a new social terrain. It's socialism or barbarism, I'm afraid. Alright, thanks for watching. This channel can only survive with generous support from patrons and anyone else who, really to be honest, shares or watches this video. So if you feel like you want to support this channel, please feel free to like it, share it, and if you can, become a patron. Patrons from $5 and up get access to a Discord server, $10 and up get their names read out in the credits, and for as low as $2 a month, you get early access to videos and all the scripts that I produce. So if you feel like you want to support this channel, please do go right ahead and do so. You can also give one-off donations via PayPal and Ko-fi. All the links are in the description. I have an awful migraine, and I'm so hot, and that is not a guilt trip, but it is true. I miraculously managed to keep this video below an hour long. I've not yet produced a video longer than an hour, and for that I am proud. H-bomb could never. With that said, I will now read out the names of patrons $10 and up who get their names read out in the credits. So we have Demo Squid, Soval Hayes, Anita Anispe, Bon Bon, Cameron, Daniel Swing, Earl Grey T, Ellis Wren, FD Signifier, Hey Joe, Joshua Moldenhauer, Catherine. Oops, I need to expand my little spreadsheet. Catherine Helm, Kate Marshall, Kim Crawley, Nina G Public Relations, S, Stephen Van Doren, Unoriginal Name, Violet, Beans, Ega Ghost, Aaron, Alex, Borland Rice, Kate Zoret, Christopher Poff, Daniel Hughes, Duncan Skinner, Esoteric Fictionalism, Eugene K, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jack, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Joel, J.R. Barbera, Caspar Gunda Westbarg Larson, Kieran Gore, Lyome, Mason Colbert, Margussie, Niels Abelgard, Paul Singleton, Via Westphal, Practical Woman, Rachel Ann, Rachel Mixon, Robin, Damash Kispeter, TV Skyan, Tim, Tinfoil Pancakes, Tom Price, Xander, Corvus. I believe that is all of it. And yeah, so thanks again for watching. And the next video, God knows what it's going to be. I have to finish doing my book redrafting this week, and my head is very sore. I might immediately lie down and die after this. I hope you like fascism. Bye. Love you.